Welcome to the Research Studio, the place where we talk to current doctoral students involved in practice-based, practice-led or practice-informed research in the arts. My name is Dr. Mark Wilsher, and I'm based at Norwich University of the Arts in the UK. I'm an artist and academic involved in doctoral supervision, and I want to use my experience of making artworks and exhibitions to think about the different roles that creative practice can play within academic research. My guest today is Amanda Geitner, who is a current doctoral student at Norwich University of the Arts. Amanda studied at the University of Western Australia and began her curatorial career at the Lawrence Wilson Art Gallery in Perth. She was assistant curator at the Mead Gallery, University of Warwick, from 1995 to 1998, and then curator at the Sainsbury Centre, University of East Anglia, until 2015. Amanda is director of the East Anglia Art Fund and is doing a PhD by practice entitled Roger Ackling, Work and Teaching. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks for being our first interviewee. Really appreciate
pleasure.
that. And I thought I'd just kick off with a really straightforward question for you, which was really what led you to decide to embark on a PhD in the first place?
There were sort of two routes. I think throughout my curatorial career, I had been really interested in doing a PhD and had actually received support funding to do one early on at the University of Western Australia. Very early in my career, I was in my 20s. Uh-huh. And actually turned it down because the assistant curator at the gallery fell in love, moved away, and I got a temporary contract to fill her place. And at that time, getting a foot into the door of this professional world seemed like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. But then I thought about it through the rest of my career, and I think without then having a topic, what I admired in my colleagues who had PhDs was their ability to write. So their sort of fearless approach to writing and the fluency and rigour of their writing, and a sort of way of thinking, I suppose, of an experience of research, a kind of rigour to their thinking and the way they went about things. So as an idea, it was always something I wanted to do. And then in early 2020, I was approached by my colleague, Dr. Rosie Gray at Norwich Castle, the curator there of contemporary and modern art. And it was their idea to do an exhibition of Roger Ackling's work. And they approached me to be their curator. And we went to see Sylvia Ackling in February of that year, just before lockdown. And we knew that an exhibition wouldn't be realised without the support of the artist's widow and the estate. And we got her wholehearted enthusiasm and support. And we even, I think, alighted in that first meeting on 2024 as the outcome date, which would mark 10 years since his death in 2014. And it was in the car on the way back to Norwich. And I think sometimes, we know as parents, don't we, sometimes really good conversations happen in cars because there's no eye contact and you're just thinking. And I was talking to Rosie about it. And I think Rosie and I arrived together. Hang on, is this my topic? Is this what I'd always wanted to do? All my curatorial career, I've skated across the surface of things. I've been a Jill of all trades. I've been sort of had to gather this instant expertise where you give a talk and everything you know is in the talk, because really you're just one exhibition catalogue and a few articles and a bit of online listening to podcasts and things in front of your audience. But you're showing the iceberg, not the tip. And I wanted to approach this differently. I wanted to do the kind of really scholarly, really well-researched show that I'd never had an opportunity to do. And I think from the first moment you begin to apply, I think one of the reasons that the application process is so useful is because it signals right from the outset the rigour of the experience you're about to encounter is.
So as we talk right now, the exhibition which you have curated of Roger Ackling's work has just finished, or it's about to close in another couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's got 10 more days.
And then it's going on tour to a couple of other venues. You've also completed a whole bunch of interviews with artists and people who are former students of Roger Ackling.
Mm-hmm.
So what stage are you in the overall PhD process? How many of those 30 to 60,000 words have you written so far? What do you need to write?
I need to write them. So we're advised from the beginning to start writing early and keep writing. And that's the advice that I would give at the end of my year 4, beginning of my year 5 to anybody else. But I had some really big, clear tasks to do. And I don't regret it. I'm not afraid of the 45,000 words I'm about to write. But I can't tell you I've already got 30. Though, you know, there's obviously the 12 you've produced for confirmation. There's the 10 that's in my catalogue essay. There's things to draw on. But for me, I think the practice outcome is the show Sunlight. And it's the show particularly at Norwich, which has been on show from the 17th of May to the 22nd of September, because it does go on to the Henry Moore Institute Leeds next year, and then on to the Pier Arts Centre in Stromness in Orkney, also in summer of next year. But it will reduce in size as it moves on each time. So the Henry Moore Institute, which is next door to the Leeds Art Gallery, is about 25% smaller, maybe 30% smaller, and the Pier Arts Centre smaller again. So I think I've resolved with my supervisory team this summer that rather than try and digest, analyse or evaluate the entire tour, we're going to take the iteration in Norwich as the practice outcome. But I think what really helped me through, particularly being a part-time student, is to have at each point really clear tasks. So I knew I was going to do interviews and really wanted to do that. But I also knew that before I sat in front of people who knew Roger Ackling and his work so well, I knew I couldn't know everything, but I knew I had to know what it was possible for me to know, and that was his archive. I had no idea how big it was. After Helen Chadwick, it's the second biggest archive that the Henry Moore Institute hold. So I went up in late 2021, at the beginning of my year 2, for 4 days, thinking, that'll do it. 4 days in an archive, that's a lot of time. And was both excited and really daunted to find that in 4 days, I think I got through the first 3 boxes of 44. And I just sort of came back and had to kind of sit down first with my husband and then later with my supervisors and digest the scale of the task.
Sure.
And in the end, I made over a dozen overnight trips to Leeds and spent more than 25 days in the archive. And interestingly, in between each visit, I was writing up the notes of that, and the notes of the archive, which I can now give to the archive so that they can search them and find anything that's in it, was over 50,000 words worth of notes. So I think I was writing all the time, but I wasn't writing towards the thesis. I was documenting the work I was doing in the archive, because in the archive I was taking photos and writing in pencil, and then I'd come back and write it all up.
Yeah, so this podcast is oriented around practice-led research in the arts. As part of your project, you have curated this exhibition, this touring exhibition.
Yeah.
You have conducted a whole bunch of interviews. And would you also consider that kind of practice of going through the archive as a creative practice in the way you took the notes and you're aiming to have them deposited in the archive themselves?
Not until you're talking to me about it now. And I think that's something that I have to consider through the thesis and consider all of the ways that I went about it. I think being part-time and having a family, I had to really carve out time and be very directional about what I was going to do next. So there was a point at which the tasks in front of me were almost like gardening. They were like, beds that I had to dig, things that needed to be planted and sowed at particular moments in time so that they would come to fruition at another moment in time. So while I was going up to the archive, I was applying to the Henry Moore Foundation for the money to support the interviews. And the interviews, is this okay as a digression?
Yeah,
I'll come back. Yeah. The interviews, I wanted to do in person. And I think there were some really basic reasons that to do with coming out of lockdown and wanting to be with people again. really wanting to get into these artist studios. Like, that's been my whole life's career, this fascination with artists and where they make and how they make. And I could have recorded them on Teams, but I didn't want to do that. And so I applied for the travel to do them. And also, I was really influenced by the Studio Lives project for the British Library. And what I sort of took from that project was a kind of thoughtfulness about when we talk about artists' work, or I suppose the visual arts generally, we tend to privilege the written word, and often the written word of art historians and curators. And I, like that project had, that really inspired me. I wanted to capture the very immediate verbal, the spoken word of the artists who were taught by this artist, especially because Roger had always said that he was interested in art and he felt that his own work was resistant to language. But that's what we have. And so that sort of even further fueled my fascination with this work that's hard to talk about, this teaching that is quite hard to pin down. You know, he taught in an era where what he was teaching was unprogrammed, unspecified, unmonitored, and unevaluated. So actually getting down to talk to people about what was your experience of these one-on-one tutorials with this person? How did he teach, and what legacy is there of his teaching practice and his work in artist practice today? So, and I needed to do the archive before I went into these artist studios.
So you're, as you say, the focus of your research is really on the artist as a teacher and how that has kind of rippled through into subsequent generations. Is that right?
I always knew it was about work and teaching. I think they tell you right from the beginning that as much time as it takes and as difficult as it is, the confirmation process, or whatever that process is called in different universities, but that sort of moment halfway through where you present work and have really an examination to work out how you're going to continue, that was really useful for me. And I think what was articulated in that by my supervisory team, Christoph and Joe, but also by my external examiner, who was David Cross, was that I was looking at this highly networked individual who, perhaps not uniquely but really distinctively, devoted 40 years and a huge amount of energy to making work, making exhibitions and teaching. And my task was to see how those activities interrelated and what was the reciprocity in them, how each one informed the other, and what significance, legacy or evidence is that in practice today. But also the challenge was, it's great. What we all do is look back and we read what's already been written. But there was a real provocation in that process to see what there is to say about Ackling's work now. And for me, that's where the final practice outcome of the exhibition lies. But you're quite right. I mean, the interviews could also be seen as practice because the artists were saying what they felt there was to be said about Ackling and his work right now. But the exhibition was always fueled by a kind of conviction that an experience of the work in the real is key. And I would say that of your work, of any artist's work. But we can overlook that, I think, sometimes, and we can look at it in reproduction and we can read what's been written about it by other people and sort of forget to keep having that immediate experience.
Well, this comes back to what you were saying about the importance of visiting artists in their studios.
Yeah.
You can talk to them online, you can read their catalogues, but nothing really beats the experience of visiting someone in their natural habitat and poking around and seeing how they operate.
Yeah.
And you get an understanding of it like that, don't you?
Yeah, and I think what I sort of, what I wrote to the Henry Moore Foundation, and this was sort of a bit of my personal fascination coming in obliquely to my kind of core research strands, was the artist Tony Cragg, who was taught by Roger Ackling when there was hardly any difference in the age between them. He was taught by Roger in the early 70s at Wimbledon, and Roger had started teaching at Wimbledon straight out of St Martin's in 1969, and they became lifelong friends, even lived together for a while. And in the summers, when the art school was out, Tony would return to the Isle of Wight to help out on Roger's parents' hotel on the Isle of Wight. And Tony recounts in his interview being there when Roger first started experimenting with magnifying glass. So Tony Cragg showed at Houghton Hall here in Norfolk. I'm scrambling slightly. I think it might have been 2021. And I think it was 2021. And I spoke to Tony at the opening. And at that point I was putting feelers out and trying to introduce myself, like really plucking up my courage. You know, these things are hard to do when you're first doing something, to walk up to somebody like Tony Cragg and go, oh, hi, I'd like to introduce myself. This is what I'm working on. And he said to me, I get so tired of talking about my own work, but I could talk about Roger all day long. And what it made me think about was a lot of these artists who are very senior in their careers, and of course Roger's peers are, I think you can get excessively rehearsed. I'm not an artist, so I don't know, but I would posit that you keep being asked similar questions. You keep answering them in the same ways, and you can get possibly a bit over-rehearsed about or tired of talking about your own work. So I wondered if I talked to artists about Roger's work, if it might prompt them to speak about their own work in a slightly different way, because I'm not asking them about their work. And actually that was some of the most rewarding moments in the interviews, in that by asking people to talk about Roger, of course they then talk about themselves. So there's this wonderful bit in the film that I really like, where I'm sitting with the lovely David Nash in his studio, where he's doing watercolours at the time. And he goes, well, the thing about carbon, and then he starts talking about carbon and the role of carbon in his own work, because he also burns quite a lot of his work. But that was great. That was exactly what I hoped would happen, is that, you know, talking about Roger, talking about me. And similarly, lots of other artists talk about what they learnt from Roger in his teaching, how that affected the way they taught. So I learned a lot about the people I spoke to that I really enjoyed.
I guess you get a sense of almost the way that themes or creative ideas are taken, used, applied and kind of synthesised by another artist. So for instance, David Nash might be thinking about carbon, be thinking about burning or that kind of process from Roger Ackling's work, but then he's doing something different with it himself. So when it's the idea of how a concept is transformed as it's passed from one artist to another, and it goes or passes through time like that, through generations.
Absolutely. And the way that David Nash talked about using carbon in his own work made me think differently about the way that carbon's operating in Ackling's work. And so, there was an incredible kind of richness to that at sort of every stage. And I think I didn't realise with the teaching element when I started the PhD, I don't think I understood or appreciated what I now feel is how distinctive that moment in British, you could even go closer and say maybe London, but of course it extended very much to Norwich and Edinburgh and other places, how distinctive that art school pedagogy was at the time. And even in his own time, this was highly unusual, but nonetheless, Ackling was able to teach at Chelsea for 40 years without ever having an office, a desk, or an institutional email address. And so he was like a kind of very, very influential ghost in the machine, like an institution within an institution. And I've really enjoyed capturing that. And I don't know what more to do with it, but I'm not embedded in Norwich University in terms of undergraduate teaching at all. So I don't have the experience of how different it is from now. But my instinct is from talking to people that it's very different. Yeah. So there is this sort of moment from that mid-60s Coldstream support, people who are educated post-Coldstream, and then the way in which they taught in the decades that followed up until about 2000, 2010, that is very distinct.
Brilliant. Okay, I want to cycle back now to something you talked about earlier on, which was the difference between curating an exhibition and curating an exhibition as a piece of research. So essentially, how has framing what you're doing, because you're a very experienced curator, you've curated many exhibitions over the years, but this is the first time it's been framed as part of a PhD for you. Yeah. So how has that changed or impacted on the way you've gone about things, or how you think about the outcome, perhaps?
Profoundly, really profoundly, in terms of be just having the time to explore something so deeply and so thoroughly, and the kind of building, confidence isn't the right word. I suppose just the building bank of knowledge, understanding, experience, references, reading, conversations that you're building something from. And it changed many times along the way. And I think often we are using phrases as students. I know you're going to ask me about methodology later, and that's another funny one. But we're using phrases that we come to understand as we're doing the work, but we don't understand them. So one of the ones that rings in everybody's ears is exhibition as research, or exhibition as research in progress, which is a really tricky one because, of course, to the visitors of the castle, this stuff is fixed to the wall. There's nothing fluid about it. But I think that even in the installation was incredibly helpful to me because it wasn't about this is the fixed and final authoritative outcome of knowledge. This is my statement. It was always, this is my best attempt, this is my proposition, this is my best running with the baton to pass on somebody else, because right from the beginning, I remember saying in my interview, which of course was deep in lockdown, it was one of the first times I'd really used Teams. I was really distracted by my face being on screen while I was having this interview. And I remember saying the fact that I want to keep looking at Ackling's work makes me think that there's a lot more to look at intellectually. And so I sort of framed the exhibition, or we kept framing it as, yes, there is so much more to do with this work. And 10 years on, there are different ways to think about it, to show it. And how do we do it? Well, this is my best attempt using the interviews to introduce the work to new audiences, and using the archive to show a much richer representation of who the artist was, but also to show the evidence on which we based our decisions about what to show and how to install it and display it.
Here's a question. Now,
Sure.
I don't want this to be a viva.
Okay.
But a question I think I have to ask you is about the relationship between the exhibition, which you've produced, and then the writing that you're going to produce alongside, and how they kind of sit together conceptually. Where is the work going to be happening, and when you come to submit at the end of this whole process, where will you be directing the readers or the examiners for the sort of the core or the important bit, or the quote new knowledge, which is so sort of crucial?
That's a really testing question, and I at this point, I really want to write my thesis. I don't want to be. I've had 4 years where each year I've had quite a distinct task to complete, and each year I've been terrified. I've just been so afraid and lost so much sleep, and I'm sort of a bit, I'm not over that, but I'm galvanized enough now to go, okay, no, now just do this part, just do this. And I think some of it might come about in the writing. I didn't know that I would feel that actually how much of the new knowledge was made manifest in the exhibition. I didn't appreciate before I did the exhibition how much of the work we would select had never been seen in the UK before, had not been seen for decades, had never been seen in concert before, that there had never been a survey exhibition of the artist's work before. So I think that there are stakes to new knowledge in that I hadn't anticipated. But I think what I had anticipated, that there was new knowledge embedded in the really systematic and complete in research of the archive, having been through the archive at every stage, and the interviews. And I think if my thesis all along has been, work exhibitions, teaching, how do those things intercalate? How do they transect? Well, that's my job now in the thesis, to actually articulate that, and to articulate that in the individual experiences of the archive and the interviews, but then also articulate the extent to which that was made evident or made manifest in the exhibition.
As far as you know, do you think you're the first researcher to have actually gone through all these 44 boxes in the archive at the Norwich Institute?
Yeah. So they hadn't, the Institute hadn't gone through them yet. I'm not the first person to have seen bits of the material.
Yeah.
So Dr. Liddy Reku-Fond has written a monograph on Ackling, The Invisible Appears, which was published in 2021 in English. And she had stayed at Sylvia Ackling, the artist widow's house in 2018, I think, and had been and had access to the material. But I was the first person that went through them in chronological order systematically and went through every single one, which was hard. But then just when I thought, I'm going through another thing I don't necessarily need to see, I'd find something extraordinary. So, but yes, those things. And actually right now, I'll make you laugh. We're in a building where the postgraduate research room is, and the essay for the catalogue, another thing I was terrified about. Many things. But to do that, and I'm going to do the same thing with my thesis, I would come in here on Fridays. So I would sort of divide my week up and say, okay, I work 3 days a week for my job. The Thursday or 1 day a week is for the logistics, the administration of the show. And I think all PhDs, but particularly practice ones, you're so unprepared for how much administration there is. I mean, every one of these 20 people I interviewed, emails and emails and emails, logistics all the way along. And then the Friday I would write, and I would come into this room and I wouldn't let myself go home till I'd written 2,000 words. They might not be good words, but till I'd written 2,000 words. So that's my approach, and you can hold me to it. From the end of this month, 2,000 words a week minimum until it's done.
Fantastic.
Yeah. When I did the confirmation training, one of the key things I took away, which makes me laugh now, was do your work schedule as a Gantt chart. I mean, that sounds laugh out loud funny, but actually that's sort of scheduling your work. And yes, I would be like, if I want to go to Wuppertal and interview Tony Cragg in October, I have to be liaising with his studio in June. I can't just decide at the beginning of October, because he's all over the world all the time, as are lots of artists. The same could be said of all the artists that I spoke to. So that sort of forward planning. But the task element was really important to me. And you can include this or cut this out as you wish, but something you said to me really early on, I've repeated to other people and was incredibly useful to me. You said to me, and this is in a way what you've just asked me that I have to do now. You said to me, remember, it's not all the work. Your PhD thesis is the PhD-shaped thing that you cut out of all the work. And that had a profound impact on my thinking, that actually just to recognise that if I try and think about all the work I've done, I get very muddled. My task now, in the next 6 months before I submit it, is to craft the PhD-shaped thing and cut that out of all the work, bake it and serve it warm.
That actually does remind me, I will bring it back to myself again anyway. It does remind me that I had written my PhD a long time ago now, and I had presented it for a mock viva with someone who came in as an external to have a look at it. And after the questioning of that process, I went away and I suddenly realised what my PhD was actually about. And at that point, I went and changed the title. I changed the start and end of every one of my chapters to frame it all completely differently. And it was that frame which gave me the point to my own, it gave me an argument to my thesis at that really late stage.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I have, that idea of thinking through writing. I'm also going to take full advantage this year of the group that the UAL postgraduate research program provides, which I think is 9 till 11 every Thursday morning, called Shut Up and Write. But that idea of just turning up for your work, the discipline of writing, and being open to the fact that while my first task, which I've done, it'll make you laugh, but that's how kind of logistically I have to go about things, is I took my description of each of my chapters from my confirmation paper and flooded it into copied it and put it into a new Word document. So I've got a little folder that says, in a folder in my PhD Outlook that says thesis, and then there's a document in each one, which I haven't really started writing yet, but it's just the description of each of those chapters. So I'm going to backfill that to start with, and then I know that some of the thinking will come about the writing.
I think a lot of people listening to this might be interested in making exhibitions, might be interested in exhibiting their own work, and so on. Now, you're obviously, as I've alluded to, a very experienced curator, and you mentioned right at the start how this whole exhibition project was kind of offered to you, and that was one of the reasons for doing the PhD in the first place. But I wondered if you had any advice for researchers out there who don't have that kind of experience about how to place their work somewhere, to find a venue to exhibit, to make an exhibition happen, which can seem so daunting from the outside if you've never really been involved in that before.
Yeah, one of the things I had to address, actually, that I have to address and be mindful of, is a kind of there's a sort of social sciences methodology in research, which is about acknowledging insider privilege. And so, though I no longer work for a museum or gallery, my charity is housed in an office which is part in the Castle Museum team. And so I acknowledge and have had to address, and will have to address, what level of kind of insider privilege I had coming out of being a curator to make this happen, because it would be, because they approached me, it would have been much harder to walk in unknown, unintroduced from the outside and say, can I stage this show? But actually, though with Roger Ackling, I think there would have been a chance, but it still is sort of looking at that. I think it's really interesting because we work in this region, which is actually privileged with a huge number of really vibrant independent spaces. And I suppose it's about engaging first in those networks of artist-led independent spaces that in our region sort of encompass everything from, working from Suffolk up, Asylum Studios, the Art Station, Saxmundham, the Cut in Halesworth, 303 Projects in Lowestoft, Primark in Great Yarmouth, Chroma Art Space more recently, and I'm now going to omit really important people and the emissions will be glaring, but just as a quick sample. And I think it's about possibly engaging with those networks first. I even know artists who have successfully brought together really good projects just by reaching out to other artists they've become aware of and have followed keenly on Instagram. I think there's some really decent curating going on through Instagram relationships. People sort of finding someone based elsewhere in the world or elsewhere in the country that they might not have otherwise known, simply because they're really interested in what they're posting. So I suppose my advice, and I suppose what Ackling modelled, which might be horrifying for some people if that kind of being in the world and socialising is kind of not your thing, but he was really, really highly networked socially as a teacher, and he championed other artists. So a lot of artists ended up showing at Cairn Gallery, which was in Gloucester, and now in Pittenweem, north of Edinburgh. Lots of people showed in galleries in lots of different places around the world because Roger recommended them, encouraged them. So I suppose that would be the other thing, is that allow yourself to be supported and support other people in turn.
Thanks.
The solo show is a really tricky one, because one of the things about the PhD is making the distinction between what this show does and what a show in a commercial gallery would do, and then being really ethically clear about what I'm doing so that I'm not caught up in the enhanced valuation of the enhanced value of this artist's work, the enhanced profile. And solo shows have been unfashionable. And so, I had to deal really early on that I was doing a solo show of a dead white British male. And how more uncool could I be? So I think in a way there might be a bit of a contribution there that I'm still trying to formulate in my head about the value of the monograph project, of the solo show, of the reframing of a single artist's work, particularly if we're also looking at their teaching at a particular moment in time and how that worked. But one of the things I have to go back to this year with my thesis is methodology, and people will be shouting as they hear this, but you were supposed to do that at the start. And I did to a certain extent, but I found it very difficult and I couldn't quite work it out. And I think the sequence in which we do things as PhD students and researchers isn't always what people expect. So it's great to hear you talk about completely reframing your thesis and top and tailing it right at the end as it came into focus. And I think similarly, people have retrofitted methodologies before, and I've heard about people doing that.
I think that's very common, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think there were particular mistakes that you made, or methodological mistakes that you made that you came to regret or see as problems?
The interviews are huge, and I think I really underestimated, despite... there's an idea too, is that each of the strands of work have methodologies. So I read about interrogating the archive and archival methodologies for research. And I read about interview methodologies and interview processes and theories. And one of the things I used in the film is, which I wouldn't have known to call it this, is an elicitation device, which is to put something, an artwork of Ackling's, in people's hands and have them talk about it. And when I showed the film, the first run was to the PhD cohort. I think you were there, Mark. Jonathan P. Watts, one of my peers, said really rewardingly to me, he said, "Oh, it's like a masterclass in attentive viewing." And of course I didn't do that. That's not my achievement. It's what my interview subjects did, because I put something in their hands and then they gave me this amazing content. But I did possibly too many interviews, and each one took forever to transcribe, even with an automated transcription. It's so flawed. And so Ackling comes out as action again and again. Like, it just takes so much combing through, hours. So the average 40-minute interview would take me an hour per 10 minutes to comb through. So it would take me 4 hours at least. And then identifying which bits I wanted to use. And then, because I didn't know that the film was going to be on a big screen in the gallery, so even though everybody had signed all the ethics clearance forms, with all the artists, I sent them back their transcript with the piece I was using in the film in blue, because I just was terrified that somebody was going to be really unhappy when they saw it, even though they'd signed the forms. So all of that took way longer than expected, and perhaps I just bit off way too much. But then again, now I'm really proud of the film, so it's sort of like, oh, well, did I? But, I think, people keep warning you how much work interviews are. And I would really encourage people to take that warning really seriously. And funnily enough as well, even though the ethics forms made people understand that the interviews could be used in the exhibition catalogue, in my PhD thesis, and in subsequent papers, conferences. It was pretty broad and pretty tight. I thought that it was going to be on a small monitor, maybe not even in the show, maybe like one of those monitors you walk out in galleries and they have headphones hanging and you put your headphones on and sit down. So I never tried to dissemble, but I actually didn't know. So though I got everyone to sign off that it could be used in the exhibition, I think if I'd said, we're going to have a film room and this enormous screen, they all would have said no. So in a way, it was like, well, it's lucky I didn't know, because I couldn't tell them, and then they would have said no. And the only kickback I've had about the film is one of the participants has said very humorously that if she'd had any idea that it was going to be on such a big screen, she never would have worn that ratty old cardigan. You can see the film and try and work out who that is that said that. Mark, while you look at that, can I just say something you might not want to use or you might want to use?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
And I don't know if you found this the same, But I found as a practice student, and obviously my practice outcome is different, and I know that. But I have found all the way along that despite my overwhelming fear and worry and sleepless nights, having immovable deadlines of enormous magnitude, to me, they don't need to be enormous magnitude to other people, but feeling like these are immovable deadlines of enormous magnitude has actually what's kept my PhD on the rails. It has been highly motivational to the point of panic at some point, but really highly motivational, has meant that it's kept a real rigour. I haven't actually gone down too many rabbit holes or got too distracted because I'm doing this next thing next. And so I suppose that's the one thing that I'm pleased about, if we're talking about regrets and things I'm pleased about, is I don't think I could have achieved this at this point in my life. I don't think I could have got through the process. And I haven't yet. I've still got to write the thesis. But even have got this far if I hadn't had deadlines that were beyond my control, that I could not move. So if people were looking at a practice outcome that is an exhibition, then my advice would book that slot, commit to it, find the venue really early on, because then it's coming towards you and you have to meet it where it is rather than push it back to when you're ready. Yeah. Because if you push it back to when you're ready, you might just never quite get ready.
And do you think, looking towards the future, once this is all over and done, and your thesis is sitting on the shelf and the hard covers are closed, the gold lettering is on the spine.
I feel like everybody who gets there has gone to Narnia and I'm still in the cupboard with the coats thrashing around. But yes, when I get out of the cupboard with the coats.
Do you see this whole process as having an impact on the way you work in future? So when you start to think about shows you might want to put together in future, will you try and engage in that depth kind of research again? Will you be able to? Will you have the resources and the time to do that? How do you think it will change the way you approach things?
Fundamentally, yeah, absolutely. It's been transformative for me in every way. And funnily enough now, I do really want to get it finished and get on, which sounds ridiculous given that I've got 40,000 words to write, but I just want to get through this last year and do the best I can with it and move on. And I think what might emerge is that the relationships you make through a practice outcome, that's where things lead you onwards. And I have a feeling that I feel like I've made some really powerful contacts, is too utilitarian a word, and it sounds a bit mercenary. Some friends, some allies, some colleagues, some people who I hope I might work with again in the future. And I think Ackling's work is of a particular type, a particular kind of, it sits in a particular place. And I think engaging with other artists' work that might have some similar resonances around it is something that I'm really interested in exploring. I'm not sure I could ever quite do this again. I think that's the opportunity and the burden of a PhD, but the opportunity is just doing something at such enormous depth. So I'm nervous to say I could do this again with another artist's work, but certainly I've just learnt so much and learnt so much about how I might think about things, how I might work with other people, how I might approach things, about how to do something in an exploratory, investigative way, and manage the bits that you don't know, manage things as a proposition, manage things not being certain and locked down. And it certainly, the show Sunlight, that is still just on at the castle now, is the show of this PhD. It's not a show, and I'm also doing a PhD. It is what it is because of this PhD.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much, Amanda Geitner. And
it's my pleasure.
Good luck with your writing.
Thank you. I'll see you on the other side.